The long struggle seems to finally be reaching its terminus. What both sides might have at first seen as a brief conflict quickly ground down to a brutal stalemate. The Ukrainians, even with the weight of the West behind them, continue to lose ground inch by inch to the Russians. Still, however, Ukrainian leadership believes that there is a chance, an opportunity to retake all that was lost if the US and EU and NATO countries as a whole chip in more, give the Ukrainians more resources, more wealth, more weaponry. And for the first time in a while, the Ukrainians are being ignored. Recently, President Trump has spoken with Vladimir Putin, and by all accounts, the discussion was very cordial, it was very respectful. There was an understanding between the two leaders, and following a discussion to work out peace terms, Trump has expressed that he anticipates a quick end to the conflict. His language, however, was not too favorable toward the Ukrainians. He argued that on their part, they could have ended this conflict at any time, that in spite of Russia's invasion, the Ukrainians themselves had a major role to play in beginning this conflict. Trump has gone as far as to describe Zelensky as a dictator. Clearly the rhetoric and the attitude toward Ukraine is not looking too favorable. This is reflected in the United States as well. Most Americans, the people of the United States as a whole, whether Republican or Democrat, have grown tired of the conflict in Ukraine. The loudest beckoning calls for more intervention in Ukraine, for more action on the side of Ukraine, comes from three sources more than any other. Ukraine itself, the European countries which have an incentive to repel Russia, which is right there on their doorstep, and neoconservative and neoliberal politicians in the United States, who have an incentive to maintain the global alliance structure and foreign interventions in Europe. Now, I have spoken about this for years at this point, even prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I had made videos about this, I had warned about the situation, about the dynamic between the United States and Russia, and now we're seeing it all materialize. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week where we talk about history and politics, so be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment about what you'd like to see next, and stay tuned for more. If you'd like to join the community, we do have a public Discord server linked in the description, along with a community-made subreddit loaded with memes, charts, maps, and more. And of course, if you'd like to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a channel member or donating to us on Patreon. Having dealt with censorship and demonetization in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, your support really goes a long way to keeping the channel going. All members do gain access to a separate members-only Discord server where you can speak with me directly. Now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. The United States in the aftermath of the Cold War, after winning the Cold War, after Russia was left in shambles, adopted a strategy of containment. And for the time, it was very sensible. From the position of a United States which had spent half a century locked in political struggle with another superpower, it's understandable why these types of precautions were taken. Intentions of keeping Russia dependent upon the West, of isolating Russia from its neighbors and former communist countries. Again, from a strategic standpoint, understanding the mindset that many of those politicians were in, it's understandable why. But as the years wore on and as dynamics changed, as the Russians, especially as Putin came into power, began making appeals to the United States for alliance, began making appeals to the United States for cooperation, the continued antagonism of Russia, of treating them like they were still the Soviet Union, it was not the right direction to take. Instead of offering a welcoming hand, the US offered a smile while it held a gun behind its back. The Russians, looking at their perspective after the fall of the Soviet Union, felt vulnerable. The political and military actions they took in the aftermath all boil down to one major thing, and that is security, particularly security from the West. The Russians do have some other threats, particularly China. A lot of people don't think about China as a threat to Russia, but the fact is the two do have conflicting interests. A lot of people say they're both part of an anti-American axis of tyranny. And again, that is an American perspective. But the Chinese recognize that they easily outnumber the Russians, that they share a border, that the Russians have resources that they might be interested in, and the Russians with an underpopulated Far East, and with China building up its alliance system in Central Asia. Well, the Russians are naturally concerned about the Chinese as well. But the bigger threat in their eyes is this encroachment from the West. And again, much of what they have done has entailed building up their security, putting up a buffer between themselves and the West and other countries. The expansion of NATO into a lot of the former Eastern Bloc countries, that certainly shook Russia quite a bit. Because now there's all this weaponry pointed right at them on their doorstep. From the European perspective, they're like, well, the Russians are right on our doorstep, and the Polish feel this especially because they have a bad history with the Russians. Granted, they have a bad history with the Germans and the Austrians and basically all their neighbors. Heck, even the Ukrainians. But between Poland and Russia, there's a very pronounced animosity. The Europeans are afraid of the Russians, and the Russians are afraid of the Europeans, and the Europeans have the benefit of having American security backing them up through NATO. The problem is, the United States doesn't have much interest in the European sphere. The Cold War is over. There's not much reason for us to be there. And again, even in Trump's cabinet, in spite of him coming off as more of an isolationist figure, there's still, of course, talks of foreign policy, but this time the focus is a pivot to Asia. The containment of China, because when you look at the situation between the US, China, and Russia, who poses the bigger threat, realistically? The Russians, if they wanted to fight us, there's not really much they can do. What are they going to do? Try to invade Alaska? Are they going to launch nukes at us? There's no winning strategy for them. The Chinese, on the other hand, do have ways of attacking us. And yes, both economically and militarily. While Russia might have more nuclear weapons than us, there's not really a threat of them doing anything to the United States directly. The Chinese, while they have fewer nukes than us, do have a very large army that they're continuing to build up. They have a very powerful economy that they're continuing to build up. At our expense, mind you, as many American businesses do head off to China, as China does end up cornering the market on a lot of major production. And this might have been something that Trump and Putin discussed, because one of the takeaways of the conversation, if memory serves, was that they had interests beyond the conflict in Ukraine, and that they needed to prepare for that instead. And what might these shared interests be? The first thing that comes to mind, again, is China. Again, I spoke about a potential Russian-American alliance years ago at this point, and I still say it's likely. You want to look at the real politics of something, the Russians and Americans really don't have any conflict of interest. If we want to talk about alliances, sure, you throw the Europeans in there, and the Europeans do have a conflict with Russia, but Russia and the United States itself, not really. And as we've heard from J.D. Vance, from Marco Rubio, from Trump himself, the United States is no longer interested in Europe. The Europeans have to carry their own weight and they have to start doing things on their own. And yet another thing I called, you have Zelensky talking about looking for a European NATO, a new alliance separate from the United States, for mutual security in that region. I mean, frankly, that was just sort of an inevitability. That had to happen at some point. Looking at the direction the United States is going and looking at the direction that Europe is going, NATO as it stands just isn't sustainable. And I think in these recent discussions, a lot of this has sort of been coming to light for Trump, or hitting him a bit more hard. The recognition that we really don't stand to benefit from this situation. And if anything, we're only making the situation worse. If the United States wasn't plugged into the conflict in Ukraine, the Russians would have steamrolled that country easily. However, thousands of lives likely would have been saved. You wouldn't have had the same level of destruction that you saw. It would have been a much quicker war. But because the United States kept feeding the flames, and this might have even been a strategy to weaken the Russians, to basically turn Ukraine into a sacrificial lamb, allow them to keep whittling down the Russian military, so that the Russians would not be in a position to invade any other part of Europe for quite a while. And that has been partially successful. It's highly unlikely the Russians are going to invade any other part of Europe. At least any other part that's currently within NATO within the short term of a few years. However, the Russians have also upped their war production, and they're just accelerating their ability to maintain a war front. In a situation where the US drops NATO immediately and those countries no longer have a nuclear shield, that could put the Baltics at risk. But if you have a counterbalance to that, say, again, a European NATO and perhaps an expansion of France or the UK's nuclear program, or not even that, just the extending of their shield to those countries, then they might be a bit more secure. Mind you, the Europeans during this time are likely going to up their war production as well. So I'm gonna say unlikely that you see conflict there. While Trump's always been a bit more brash in his language, what is coming across, even from the more mild-mannered members of his team, Marco Rubio namely, is that this is not going to be a victory for Ukraine. Both sides are going to have to make compromises. And despite what JD Vance had said during his speech to Munich, it's quite possible that even if the American version of NATO isn't extended to Ukraine, some type of European military alliance is going to be given to Ukraine. Some level of integration with the Western countries of Europe is going to happen. But in turn, the Russians are likely going to get a good chunk of land to act as something of a buffer for them. The key words that have been thrown around are lasting perpetual peace. They don't want to just put a band-aid on this and close the war as it is. They want to find a way to appease both parties and prevent the outbreak of a conflict in that same region for the perpetual future. The only way I really see that happening is if the Russians get their border up to the Dnieper River, establishing that natural barrier and putting more space between them and the Europeans, specifically making it more difficult for the Europeans to launch a land invasion across the European plain and attack Moscow. This is going to be all the more important for the Russians, especially now that the Europeans are talking about militarizing. And this is something that Zelensky's been hammering home as well, and no doubt Putin's paying attention to it. At the end of this, Ukraine probably isn't going to be protected by the United States, but the Europeans will likely offer some form of military protection to them, independently of the United States. What's left of Ukraine is probably going to get militarized to the teeth unless there's some type of provision where it won't be militarized for X amount of time, just to give the Russians some security until they're able to rebuild. And probably the same thing is going to go for the Russians, where their newly occupied territory can't be militarized for a certain period of time. That's just me speculating on what the peace deal is, but very likely Ukraine's going to be significantly diminished of territory. It's a very dynamic situation with a lot of moving pieces, but if you look at the bigger picture, at the end of the day, what all parties want, and what all parties can realistically do, I'm thinking this is going to be the most likely outcome. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.